For instance, were the Levites and the priests not supposed to live from the tithes? Well, let us read further from Deuteronomy chapter 14, this time verse 27, right up to verse 29. You shall not forsake the Levites who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. At the end of every third year you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year, and store it up within your gates. And the Levites, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates, may come and eat, and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand, which you do. Here are two important questions that we need to look at from this passage of Scripture. First of all, what tithes were not eaten by the tither, but were set aside to be given away? Were the tithes given every month? Was it perhaps given every year? Or was the tithes of the year's increase given on the third year? The tithes of the first 2 years were eaten before the Lord by the tither. It was only the third year's tithe that was given away. Secondly, to whom was the third year tithe given to? Was it given to the church or the pastor? Or was it all given to the Levites and the priests? Neither. The third year's tithe was distributed among the strangers, the orphans, and the widows, and a portion of the third year's tithe came to the Levites. Does your church teach that about tithing, or do they deliberately avoid this passage? Another passage of Scripture teaches and confirms this, and is found in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 12, right up to verse 13. When you have finished laying aside all the tithe of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levites, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled, then you shall say before the Lord your God, I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given them to the Levites, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. Now, let me ask you again, was it the tithe of their decrease or the increase that the tither tithed on? Of their increase, of course. Israel did not tithe when there was a famine, because tithing was a celebration of God's increased blessings. It's amazing the revelation one gets when one reads what is actually written in Scripture and not what other people want you to read. According to this passage then, what tithes were given away? Once again, we read it was the third year's tithe, because the other 2 years were eaten by the tither before the Lord. Do we read in this passage that the tithe were only given to the Levites? No, it was also given to the strangers, the orphans, and the widows. At this point, we have only read that the Levites, along with the strangers, the orphans, and the widows, lived from the third year's tithes. How did the priests receive tithes then? I'm reading now from Numbers chapter 18 verse 25 right up to verse 28. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, When you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Lord, a tenth of the tithe. And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes which you receive from the children of Israel, and you shall give to the Lord's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest. Who were responsible to tithe to the Lord in order for the priest to live from it? A. The church members. B. The Israelites. C. The priest. D. The Levites. It was the Levites and not the rest of Israel who were to give to the priest. The Levites had to give a tenth of the portion of tithes they received from the rest of Israel to Aaron and his descendants, who would be the priests. The question arises then, what was the difference between the priests and the Levites? You might recall that God commanded in Exodus chapter 13 that the first fruit of all of Israel, whether it be agriculture, livestock, and the firstborn sons of Israel, are to be dedicated to God. This they had to do because God delivered them from the Egyptians using the 10 plagues. by killing the firstborn from all of Egypt, of man and livestock. Then in Numbers chapter 3 verse 40 right up to verse 51, God commanded that instead of all the tribes of Israel having to offer up their firstborn son to do service for God, that the one tribe of Israel, the Levites, would substitute the firstborn of Israel to serve him by the tabernacle and later on in the temple in Jerusalem. Aaron, Moses' brother, who by the way was from the Levite tribe, was chosen by God to be the priest for Israel. Aaron's descendants would be the Levitical priesthood. The rest of the Levites were then in service to the priests. For that reason, the Levite tribe had to pay a tenth of the tithes they received from the other tribes on the third year and give it to the priests who were the descendants of Aaron. So it was the Levites and not the rest of Israel that were responsible to give a tenth to the priests. So who was then responsible for the storehouse of God that we hear so often preach about over the pulpit? In the gates of Jerusalem, God placed His name, and it was there where Israel was to celebrate the feast of Tithing. It was also in Jerusalem where the house of God was built. Let us now look at who was responsible to supply to the house of God and in what way they were to supply to the house of God. We read from Nehemiah chapter 10 verse 36 right up to verse 37. To bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priest who ministers in the house of our God. To bring the first fruits of our dough, our offerings, the fruit from all kinds of trees, the new wine and oil, to the priest, to the storerooms of the house of our God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites, for the Levites should receive the tithes in all our farming communities. Before I read on, at this stage, what did Israel bring to the house of God? They brought the first fruit of all that is produced agriculturally. Did Israel also bring the tithes to the storehouse of God? No. The tithes were given to the Levites. Let me read it to you once again. To bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn from our herds and our flocks, to the house of our God, to the priest who ministers in the house of our God. To bring the first fruit of our dough, our offering, the fruit from all kinds of trees, the new wine and oils to the priest, to the storerooms of the house of our God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites. For the Levites should receive the tithes in all our farming communities. This is important to understand as we read the verse that follows in Nehemiah chapter 10 verse 38. And the priest, the descendants of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes, and the Levites shall bring up a tenth of the tithes to the house of our God, to the rooms of the storehouse. Now, who were to bring the tithes to the storehouse of God? Was it A, the Christians, B, the Israelites, or C, the Levites? It is very clear that it was the Levites who were to bring the tithes to the house of God. I want to stress this point that it was only the Levites and not the rest of the Israelites who brought their tithes to the storehouse of God. The Israelites were only responsible to bring the first fruit offering to the house of God. Now, let us look at the passage of Scripture that is so often used to manipulate and deceive the church to give money. It is Malachi chapter 3 verse 8 and verse 9. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation.